Scholar Bhikkhu Anālayo is coming out with material all the time, or so it seems. He has a recent book out called Daughters of the Buddha that I've just read. I got a message recently by a viewer, Christy Woodard, who asked me to do a video on this book and to bring out an important story of one woman in the book, which I will get to at the end. So in general, what I'm going to do in this video is I'll first give a quick review of the book, and then I'll turn to 5 stories of Indian women, of bhikkhunis and laywomen from the book that I think are important, and finish up with the 5th story being the one that Christy Woodard felt had an important lesson for us. So first I'll start with a general review of the book. This is a book that involves stories of 21 early Buddhist women, 17 bhikkhunis being Buddhist nuns, and 4 laywomen. And as is normal with Anālayo's books and Anālayo's approach generally, it's a comparative approach. That is to say, he doesn't only involve translations from Pali, which is the ancient Indian language that a lot of material was written in, but also he includes translations from Chinese, the equivalent sutras in Chinese, some from Tibetan, and from other Indian languages. So what he's doing is a comparative approach to try to tease out what in general was said about these women that is consistent between these various recensions of the same material. Importantly, I don't think this is intended to be a comprehensive history of women in the early Sangha by any means. It leaves aside, I think, a lot of discussion of the relative second-class character of women in the early Sangha, as well as the relative lack of material about women in that Sangha. As such, it's more of a celebration of what is there than a discussion of the entire corpus of what is and isn't there and the problems that might come up with that. I think the book is intended to be inspirational to contemporary women Buddhists and to people who support women in Buddhism. It's supposed to be, I think, sort of a glass half full type or glass partly full type of book that's giving us inspiration again, that's giving us a sort of a good feeling about the few women that are highlighted in the early texts. As such, as I say, it's not really a balanced picture, but is rather intended to be inspirational. The positive, uplifting message that Bhikkhu Anālayo provides for us in the book is very useful, though, I think, and will be, I think, a great benefit to many people, and as well is a good comparative look of the early material, and as such will be important to scholars as well who are looking for this kind of comparative look at what these women, how these women are portrayed in the different recensions of the same material. Second, I want to turn to some stories that, for me, are highlights. Perhaps the greatest highlight for me is the story of the origination of the very famous parable of the chariot. Some of you will know that the chariot is used in a very famous early Buddhist parable to sort of denote the self, the way the self can be decomposed, the way a chariot can be. This story is somewhat marred by the fact that we don't really see, at least from Anālayo's telling, don't really seem to know the name of the bhikkhuni involved. In the Pali tradition, she's known as Vajira, and I've discussed her in past videos, but Anālayo seems to think that the more correct name is Sela, who in the Pali tradition is someone somewhat different. Now, one has to say that, in several of these stories, it's not clear what the exact name of the bhikkhuni is. Anālayo points out that that's also true of some bhikkhus, of some monastic monks, male monks. In other words, in the early tradition, sometimes names get sort of mixed up, or people will have more than one name. It might be that they had a given name and a name that they got given later when they became a monastic, or something like that. I mean, they may go by different designations. So there's always some, or in many of these stories, there's something of a question. That aside, in this story, the story is that Vajira, or Sela, is confronted by Mara, the tempter. This is this sort of demon tempter that tempts people in early Buddhism, and Buddhism in general. And Mara wants to confuse her and scare her, so it seems, and so asks her to contemplate who she really was as a sentient being. You, as a sentient being, basically think you know who you are. Who are you really? Where do you begin and where do you end? And Vajra or Sela responds this way. Why do you believe there's such a thing as a sentient being? Mara, is this your theory? This is just a pile of conditions. You won't find a sentient being here. When the parts are assembled, we use the word chariot. So too, when the aggregates are present, sentient being is the convention we use. But it's only suffering that comes to be, lasts a while, then disappears. Naught but suffering comes to be, naught but suffering ceases. The point here is that a person or a self or a sentient being really isn't anything over and above these conditioned aggregates that are assembled together and always changing. There's not something separate that's coming to be and passing away. There's only this kind of ever-flowing series of aggregates that come to be and pass away. All that's experienced, she says, is suffering and the ending of suffering. This is part of that mass of aggregates. There is no experience of a self. There's no experience of a sentient being as such. All that there are experiences, let's say, of dukkha and the ceasing of dukkha or of other things. It's worth pausing a moment here to consider the role of Mara in many of these stories. If you read this book, you'll find Mara coming up again and again in the guise of a tempter, of a man harassing these women, in particular these female monastics, these bhikkhunis. And the fact that Mara comes up again and again in these stories told by bhikkhunis makes me wonder to what extent he is a stand-in for the men around them who are constantly perhaps harassing them in one way or another, either trying to get them to give up robes or trying to attract them sexually or even assault them sexually. I mean, there's different guises in which Mara seems to arise in various of these stories that Anālayo points out. But the one constant in all of these stories is these women's imperturbability in the face of Mara's harassment and their ability to overcome Mara. Second, we find another early innovation in a discussion between the nun Dhammadina and a person who may be her ex-husband or ex-boyfriend, whatever, lover, it's hard to say, there's different traditions, but in any event, a man named Visakha. And in this is a lengthy and fascinating sutta, but one of the interesting points that comes out in it is that Dhammadina gives an innovative description of the breadth of Dharma practice. In particular, she gets at the breadth of what's known as the triple training, this kind of formula of three that we find indeed in Buddhism in general. That is, the practice can be understood as a practice of ethics, meditation, and wisdom, a three-part practice. We often hear, for example, that right speech, right action, and right livelihood are part of the ethics portion of practice. That right effort and right mindfulness and right concentration are the parts of the meditation practice. And finally, that right view and right intention are part of the wisdom part of practice. That is to say that the Eightfold Path actually we can break up the Eightfold Path into three types of practice. This is something that we're often taught. And Dhammadina's point is not merely to make this kind of separation, perhaps, but to claim that the description of the path in terms of a triple training, these three categories, is actually a more comprehensive picture of the path than is the Eightfold Path itself. She says, the three spectrums of practice are not included in the Noble Eightfold Path. Rather, the Noble Eightfold Path is included in the three practice categories. And this is actually kind of a surprising claim. My colleague Justin Whitaker and I actually wrote a paper on the topic of these three practice categories several years ago for the Oxford Handbook of Buddhist Ethics. I did a video about that paper a while back. I'll leave a link to the video down below and a link to the essay as well in case you want to read it. But in any event, as I say, the claim is surprising. I mean, after all, ordinarily, traditionally, the Eightfold Path is understood to be the referent of the Fourth Noble Truth. In other words, the truth of the path just is the Eightfold Path itself. And yet, we can think of practices that aren't explicitly part of the Eightfold Path, but are nevertheless important practices for achieving enlightenment, for achieving nirvana. As Bhikkhu Anālayo says, Dhammadina here makes her own distinct contribution to Buddhist thought by explicitly clarifying that the Noble Eightfold Path does not comprise the whole of the triple training, as it can comprise forms of training that are not explicitly covered by the Eightfold Path. For example, we can think of the case of the Brahma Viharas, practices of loving kindness, compassion, sympathetic joy, and equanimity. These practices, again, are not explicitly part of the Eightfold Path. They could be considered part of right concentration, perhaps, but again, that's pushing it a little bit. Usually right concentration traditionally is understood simply to be the four jhanas, but in any event, the point is that this triple training is a broader understanding, and this is something that seems to originate with the Bhikkhunī Dhammadina. A third example of relative innovation involves the Bhikkhunī Kajangala, who gives a lengthy and complex answer to what are called the 10 Great Questions. Now, I'm not going to go into all of that here, that would take too long, but the point is that she gave a lengthy and complex answer, and in a separate sutta, the Buddha gave a lengthy and complex answer, and these two answers differed from one another. They came up with different answers to each of these, or to many of these 10 important questions. And yet, the sutta says that the Buddha lauded her answer. It lauded Bhikkhunī Kajangala's answer to these questions, which raises the point that many of these questions in ancient times may have been open-ended, may have intended to be open-ended in their answers. They were not intended to have specific word-for-word answers, but rather be potentially ways that you could get across general dharmic themes without having to use the same exact points at each stage along that path. That is, word-for-word agreement with the Buddha's own answer wasn't necessary, and that's something that I think might be important to point out and be surprising, because often it may seem as though one has to sort of agree with the Buddha word for word in order to get the answer right. In this case, that was not the case. Fourth, Anālayo highlights stories of Queen Mallika, who I have talked about a number of times in my videos and appears to be a woman of really very sharp intellect. In particular, the point that he makes, which I think is a very interesting one, is that she seems to be the one who brought her husband, King Pasenadi, to Buddhism. Now, King Pasenadi was one of the greatest benefactors of the Buddha in the early Sangha. Without King Pasenadi, it's not clear how successful the Buddha would have been. Again, he was one of the Buddha's major donors. And again, it seems, again, from the sutta evidence, as though Queen Mallika was responsible for making her husband interested in what the Buddha had to say. So in a sense, we have her to thank for the important part that King Pasenadi played in the early Sangha. Finally, fifth, I want to touch on this story that I mentioned at the outset that Christy Woodard believes has a lesson to teach us, and I agree. And this is the story of the Bhikkhuni Vira. In the Chinese Samyuktagama, there's a passage where the narrator laments about this bhikkhuni and says, "People in the town of Rajagaha must be drunken, confused, or asleep, as nobody is making offerings to the nun Vira. The nun Vira is brave and has cultivated all the faculties. She aptly teaches about seclusion from pollution, about nirvana, the cool state." And then it says that a layperson gives a robe to the Bhikkhuni Vira, which is of great karmic merit for this layperson. Now, the Pali is somewhat different. There, the name of the Bhikkhunī is not Vira, but rather Sukha. So this is another one of these issues where we have with names. And instead of giving the layperson giving a robe, the layperson gives her food. But be that as it may, the point here is that the monastic path is a difficult one in that it requires donations from the laity in order to be sustainable. And further, it's more difficult to sustain such a path as a female monastic. As Anālayo points out, gaining such requisites as these is often a problem for monastics dedicated to a more secluded life, but is all the more challenging for nuns who often find it additionally difficult to gain material support compared to monks. And in this regard, I think little has changed in these intervening millennia. Bhikkhunis nowadays as well find it particularly difficult to gain and maintain the support requisite to continue being a monastic or continue to being monastics. And there is a place that one can donate to support bhikkhunis. This is known as the Alliance for Bhikkhunis. And so what I'm going to do is to leave a link to that Alliance for Bhikkhunis down in the notes, and I'll pin a note as well. So if you want to donate to them, you have a place to do so. I also have a playlist of videos on women in Buddhism, and I'll leave a link to that playlist on the screen here if you would like to see more of my videos on the same topic. Thanks so much for joining and for watching these videos. I hope you have a great time, great day, and continue supporting the Bhikkhunis. Thanks so much, and we'll catch you on the next one. And meanwhile, all of you, be well.